The FBI agent's badge gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of my office building's lobby. Special Agent Martinez, she said, extending her hand with the kind of firm grip that meant business. We need to discuss some financial documents that bear your signature, documents totaling $900,000. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My stomach dropped to somewhere around my ankles. $900,000? I'd never borrowed that much money in my entire life. Hell, I'd never even seen that much money in one place. There has to be some mistake, I stammered, clutching my morning coffee like it might anchor me to reality. I work in marketing. I drive a used Honda. I split grocery bills with my roommate. Agent Martinez studied my face with the intensity of someone trained to spot lies. That's exactly why we need to talk, Miss Caldwell, because according to these loan documents, you've been living quite differently than you claim. My name is Elena Caldwell, and until that Tuesday morning in October, I thought the biggest problem in my life was deciding whether to splurge on name-brand cereal. I was 26, working as a junior marketing coordinator at a mid-sized advertising firm in Denver, living paycheck to paycheck in a shared apartment with my college roommate Sarah. My biggest financial achievement was having a 3-month emergency fund, which my financial advisor, Brother Marcus, had helped me set up. Marcus. Even thinking his name now makes my chest tighten with a mixture of rage and heartbreak that I'm still learning to process. He was supposed to be the responsible one, the financial genius who'd graduated from Wharton with honors and landed a prestigious job at a wealth management firm. He was the brother who'd taken me to lunch every month since I'd moved to Denver, ostensibly to check on my finances and make sure I was staying on track with my savings goals. Agent Martinez and I found ourselves in Conference Room B at my office, a sterile space that smelled like industrial carpet and broken dreams. She spread documents across the fake wood table like she was dealing cards for the world's worst poker game. Each page bore my signature, or what looked exactly like my signature, authorizing loans that made my head spin. A $200,000 business loan for something called Caldwell Consulting Services, a $300,000 real estate investment loan for a property in Aspen, a $400,000 equipment financing agreement for cryptocurrency mining hardware. The dates spanned the last 18 months, a period during which I'd been struggling to afford my portion of a security deposit on our current apartment. I've never seen any of these documents before, I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. This isn't possible. I don't own a business. I've never been to Aspen. I don't even understand cryptocurrency. Agent Martinez nodded as if she'd expected this response. The handwriting analysis will determine if these signatures are authentic, but our preliminary investigation suggests sophisticated forgery. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo that made my blood turn to ice water. It was Marcus, shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit outside a bank I'd never set foot in. Your brother has been very busy, she continued. The loans were all approved based on falsified income statements, tax returns, and employment verification. Someone went to great lengths to make you appear far more financially successful than you actually are. The room started spinning. Marcus had access to all my personal information. He'd helped me set up my online banking, knew my social security number, had copies of my tax returns for the emergency fund planning. He'd even insisted on being my emergency contact for everything, claiming it was the responsible thing to do since our parents lived across the country in Portland. Where is the money now? I managed to ask. That's what we're trying to determine. Agent Martinez closed her phone and leaned forward. $900,000 doesn't just disappear. Someone spent it, and we need to find out who and where. I thought about Marcus's lifestyle over the past year and a half. The new Tesla he'd claimed was a company car. The expensive dinners he'd insisted on paying for during our monthly meetings, always at upscale restaurants I could never afford. The designer clothes that had replaced his former business casual wardrobe. The mentions of a new downtown loft that he'd been vague about when I'd asked to visit. My brother, I said slowly, the words feeling like glass in my throat. You think my brother stole my identity to get these loans? We think your brother committed wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. Agent Martinez gathered the documents back into a neat stack. The question is whether you were involved or if you're another victim. Another victim. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. My own brother had turned me into a victim of financial crime, and I hadn't even known it was happening. The monthly lunches where he'd praised my financial responsibility suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. He'd been monitoring my actual financial situation to make sure his fictional version of me remained plausible. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you need a lawyer." Agent Martinez handed me her card, a good one. "Even if you're innocent, and our investigation suggests you are, you're going to be dealing with the fallout from this for a long time. The banks will want their money back, your credit is destroyed, and if your brother can't be located, they might come after you as the supposed borrower." "Can't be located?" My voice cracked. "What do you mean can't be located?" "Your brother hasn't shown up to work in 3 days. His apartment was cleared out over the weekend. His phone goes straight to voicemail." Agent Martinez stood up, smoothing down her jacket. "Elena, I need to ask you directly. When was the last time you spoke to Marcus?" The answer hit me like a freight train. Our monthly lunch, last Thursday, 5 days ago. He'd been acting strange, more distracted than usual. I'd attributed it to work stress, but now I remembered how he'd hugged me extra long when we said goodbye. How he'd told me he was proud of me, unprompted. How he'd insisted on paying for my meal even though I'd offered to split it for once. "He knew," I whispered. "Last Thursday, he already knew you were investigating." Agent Martinez nodded grimly. "We believe so. We'd started pulling bank records the previous week. If your brother is smart, and our investigation suggests he is, he probably had exit strategies in place." After Agent Martinez left, I sat alone in conference room B, staring at my reflection in the black computer screen. My supervisor had given me the rest of the day off after I'd explained the situation in the vaguest possible terms. "How do you tell your boss that the FBI thinks your brother turned you into an unwitting accomplice to a nearly $1 million fraud scheme?" I called Sarah from the parking lot, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial her number. "Elena, what's wrong? You sound terrible." "Marcus stole my identity," I said without preamble. "The FBI thinks he's taken out almost $1 million in loans using my name and information." Silence stretched across the line before Sarah let out a low whistle. "Holy shit. Elena, are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm sitting in my car outside my office having an existential crisis. The FBI agent said I need a lawyer, a good one." I started laughing, though nothing about this was funny. "Do you know how much good lawyers cost? Because apparently I'm about to own $900,000 I never borrowed." "Come home," Sarah said firmly. "We'll figure this out."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Don't make any decisions until you've eaten something and processed this properly. But as I drove through Denver's downtown traffic, my mind was already racing ahead to all the implications I hadn't had time to consider in that sterile conference room. My credit score was probably in ruins. My dream of buying a small house in the next few years was obliterated. Any background checks for future jobs would flag me as a financial risk. Marcus hadn't just stolen money, he'd stolen my entire financial future. The apartment I shared with Sarah was a modest 2-bedroom in a complex that had seen better decades, but it had always felt like a sanctuary. Now, as I climbed the stairs to our unit, I wondered how long I'd be able to afford even this. If the banks came after me for Marcus's debt, I might lose everything. Sarah was waiting with a bottle of wine and a plate of the stress-eating cookies she kept in the freezer for emergencies. She took one look at my face and poured 2 very large glasses. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Tell me everything." So I did. The FBI visit, the forged signatures, the missing brother, the destroyed credit. With each detail, Sarah's expression grew more serious. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You know what doesn't make sense," she finally said. "Marcus is smart. Really smart. If he was going to commit fraud, why use your identity? Why not create fake personas? Why involve family?" I'd been wondering the same thing. Marcus had always been careful, methodical. Even as kids, when he'd get into trouble, he'd have elaborate plans to avoid consequences. This seemed almost sloppy. "Unless," I said slowly, He needed it to be me specifically. What if he needed someone with a real credit history, a real job, a real address, someone whose information he had complete access to? Sarah nodded, and someone who trusted him completely. Someone who would never think to check their credit report because their financially savvy brother was helping them manage everything. The realization hit me like a physical weight. Marcus had been planning this for years. Every piece of financial advice he'd given me, every system he'd helped me set up, every emergency contact form he'd insisted on being listed on, it had all been preparation for this. He'd been grooming me to be the perfect victim. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a wild moment, I hoped it might be Marcus with some explanation that would make this all make sense. Instead, it was a message that made my blood run cold. Stop talking to the FBI or things will get worse for you. Your brother borrowed that money for good reasons. Pay it back quietly and this all goes away. Sarah read the message over my shoulder and immediately grabbed her own phone. We're calling the police right now. That's a threat. No, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. We're calling Agent Martinez. This just became evidence. Agent Martinez answered on the first ring, and when I read her the message, I could practically hear her taking notes. Elena, this changes things. Can you forward that message to me immediately? And I need you to understand something important. You're not just a victim anymore. You're a witness in a federal investigation. That message suggests your brother might not be working alone. After I hung up, Sarah and I sat in silence, the weight of the situation settling around us like fog. Marcus wasn't just my brother who'd made a terrible mistake. He was a criminal who'd destroyed my life as part of some larger scheme, and now someone was threatening me to keep quiet about it. The next few days passed in a blur of lawyers, consultations, credit reports, and sleepless nights. The lawyer Sarah helped me find, Rebecca Torres, was everything Agent Martinez had said I'd need. Sharp, experienced, and expensive. She reviewed my case with the thoroughness of a surgeon. Your brother chose you very carefully, she explained during our first meeting. You have a stable employment history, no previous debt issues, and a clean legal record. You were the perfect identity to borrow against. The fact that he's your brother gave him access to information that would be impossible for a stranger to obtain. She spread out copies of the loan documents, pointing to details I'd missed during the FBI meeting. Look at these addresses. All of them are places you've actually lived or worked. The phone numbers are variations of your real number. Even the references are people from your actual life, just contacted in ways that made the lies seem plausible. How is that possible? I asked. Your brother told your former landlord he was helping you apply for a business loan and needed verification of your rental history. He contacted your old manager at the restaurant where you worked in college, claiming he was doing a background check for a promotion you were applying for. He used real information to create a fictional financial profile. Rebecca pulled out another document that made my heart sink. This is the most sophisticated part. He didn't just forge your signature. He created an entire fake employment history showing you as a senior consultant at his wealth management firm. According to these documents, you've been earning $250,000 annually for the past 3 years. But people at his work would know that's not true, I protested. Rebecca shook her head. We contacted his firm. Marcus Caldwell was terminated 6 months ago for undisclosed violations of company policy. They won't give us details due to legal constraints, but reading between the lines, they discovered some irregularities in his client accounts. The room felt like it was tilting. Marcus had been unemployed for 6 months, which meant all those expensive dinners, the new car, the downtown loft, everything had been funded by money stolen in my name. While I'd been proud of my brother's success, he'd been living off money borrowed against my identity. There's more, Rebecca continued gently. The cryptocurrency mining operation, it's real. We found the facility outside Colorado Springs. It's registered under your name as the business owner. You're legally responsible for the lease, the utility bills, and the equipment financing. I stared at her, my brain struggling to process this information. You're telling me I accidentally became a cryptocurrency entrepreneur without knowing it? Accidentally is putting it mildly. According to the business registration, you're the CEO of a company you've never heard of, operating a facility you've never seen, using equipment you never purchased to mine cryptocurrency you've never owned. The absurdity of it might have been funny if it wasn't destroying my life. Where's the cryptocurrency now? I asked. That's the $900,000 question, Rebecca said. The mining operation stopped producing profitable returns about 4 months ago. The equipment was liquidated 3 months ago, but we can't trace where that money went. The facility is empty except for unpaid utility bills in your name. Over the following weeks, I learned more about my fictional business empire than I'd ever wanted to know. Caldwell Consulting Services, the company I apparently owned, had contracts with clients I'd never met for services I couldn't provide. The Aspen property I'd supposedly invested in was a luxury condo that Marcus had been renting out on vacation rental platforms, pocketing the income while leaving me responsible for the mortgage payments that were now 3 months behind. Every revelation was another layer of betrayal. Marcus hadn't just stolen money in my name, he'd built an entire alternate version of my life, one in which I was successful and wealthy enough to justify these massive loans. He'd been living as both himself and me, using my identity whenever his own wasn't sufficient. The threatening messages continued, always from different numbers. Pay back the money and we'll forget this happened. Your brother was just trying to help his family.
Stop making this difficult. Each message was forwarded to Agent Martinez, building a case that was becoming more complex by the day. 2 weeks after that first FBI visit, I was summoned to Agent Martinez's office for what she called a comprehensive briefing. The federal building downtown was exactly as intimidating as I'd expected, all concrete and security checkpoints, and the kind of institutional lighting that made everyone look guilty of something. Elena, Agent Martinez said once we were seated in her office, I need to prepare you for what we've discovered. Your brother's operation was far more extensive than initial reports indicated. She opened a thick file folder and pulled out what looked like a family tree, except instead of relatives, it showed bank accounts, shell companies, and cryptocurrency wallets all connected by red lines like some kind of financial conspiracy theory. Marcus created at least 7 different business entities using variations of your personal information. Each entity obtained loans from different banks, always staying just under the threshold that would trigger additional federal oversight. The total amount we've identified so far exceeds $1.2 million. $1.2 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like play money in a board game. But the sick feeling in my stomach was very real. The cryptocurrency mining was just one revenue stream. He also used your identity to secure a business line of credit that funded a day trading operation. When that failed, he used another loan to start a consulting business that existed only on paper. Each failure led to another loan using your name to cover the losses from the previous scheme. Agent Martinez pulled out photographs that showed Marcus in various locations, always well-dressed, always confident. Here he is meeting with potential investors for a real estate development project in Vail. Here he is at a cryptocurrency conference in Miami. And here he is purchasing a boat with cash in a marina outside San Diego. A boat? I stared at the photo showing Marcus shaking hands with a marina employee next to a sleek white yacht. He gets seasick in bathtubs. The boat was purchased 2 months ago for $80,000 cash. We believe he was preparing multiple exit strategies. Agent Martinez closed the file. Elena, I need to ask you something difficult. In all your interactions with Marcus over the past year, did he ever seem desperate, worried? Did he ever ask you unusual questions about your job, your finances, or your plans? I thought back through months of lunches and phone calls, searching for red flags I'd missed. There had been something different about Marcus lately, but I'd attributed it to work stress. He'd been asking more questions about my job, showing unusual interest in my marketing campaigns and client relationships. He'd also been insistent about updating my emergency contact information, claiming it was important for my financial planning. There was one thing, I said slowly. About 3 months ago, he offered to help me apply for a business credit card. He said it would help build my credit score faster. I told him I didn't need one since I wasn't running a business, but he kept bringing it up. Agent Martinez made a note. Did you ever give him permission to apply for anything on your behalf? Never. I was always very clear about wanting to handle my own finances. That was actually something we'd argued about. He thought I was being too conservative, too cautious. He said I'd never build wealth if I didn't take some risks. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had been lecturing me about taking financial risks while secretly risking my entire future without my knowledge. There's something else you need to know, Agent Martinez said. We've been monitoring Marcus's known associates in communications. We believe he may have been involved with a larger fraud network. The threatening messages you've been receiving suggest he owes money to people who aren't content to wait for legal proceedings. You mean criminals? The word felt strange in my mouth. My brother was involved with actual criminals? The line between white-collar fraud and organized crime is often thinner than people realize. When you're dealing with this much money, the people who invest in these schemes aren't always legitimate business people. Agent Martinez's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with an expression that didn't fill me with confidence. Elena, I need you to be very careful over the next few weeks. Vary your routine, be aware of your surroundings, and call me immediately if you receive any more threats or if anyone approaches you asking about Marcus. As I left the federal building, Denver's autumn air felt sharp against my skin. The city looked the same as it had that morning, but everything felt different. I was no longer Elena Caldwell, struggling junior marketing coordinator. I was Elena Caldwell, unwitting participant in a $1 million fraud scheme, target of criminal threats, and sister to a fugitive who destroyed my life to fund his own fantasies. I drove home in a daze, my mind cycling through years of memories with Marcus, looking for signs I'd missed. The brother who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd helped me move to Denver, who'd celebrated my college graduation with more enthusiasm than our parents, had been systematically destroying my financial future while pretending to protect it. Sarah was waiting with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine that was definitely too expensive for our budget. She took one look at my face and poured 2 very large glasses. "Worse than we thought?" she asked. Marcus apparently turned me into a cryptocurrency mogul and real estate investor without mentioning it. Also, the FBI thinks he's involved with criminals, and someone's been sending me threatening messages. Sarah nearly choked on her wine. Criminals? Elena, this is insane. Your brother helped you balance your checkbook last month. Apparently, my checkbook was the least of his concerns. I collapsed onto our secondhand couch, feeling like I'd aged 10 years in 10 hours. Sarah, what if I can't prove I didn't know? What if they decide I was part of it? Then we'll deal with that too, she said firmly. But Elena, you're the most honest person I know. You return extra change to cashiers. You've never even downloaded music illegally. There's no way anyone who actually investigates this will think you're capable of $1 million fraud. But that was exactly what terrified me. I'd been so naive, so trusting, that I'd handed my brother everything he needed to destroy me. And now I had to prove a negative, prove that I hadn't known about crimes committed in my own name. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through possibilities and consequences. If Marcus had planned this for months or years, what else had he done that I didn't know about? Were there more loans, more businesses, more debts I'd discover tomorrow or next week? My phone buzzed with another unknown number. This time, the message was more specific. Your brother owes us money. Since he's gone, that debt transfers to you. We know where you work, where you live, where you shop. Pay up or face consequences. I screenshot the message for Agent Martinez, but this time I felt something different alongside the fear. Anger. Pure, clean anger that cut through the confusion and self-doubt I'd been drowning in since this nightmare began. Marcus hadn't just stolen money, he'd put me in danger. He'd made me a target for people who clearly didn't care about legal proceedings or innocence. He'd blown up my life and then disappeared, leaving me to face the consequences of his choices. I'd spent the past 2 weeks feeling like a victim, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond my control. But lying there in the dark, receiving threats from my brother's criminal associates, something shifted inside me. I was still a victim, but I didn't have to remain helpless. Marcus thought he was so smart, so careful, so several steps ahead of everyone else. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated me. He saw his little sister, the marketing coordinator who needed help with her emergency fund, the cautious one who'd never taken financial risks. What he didn't see was the woman who'd built marketing campaigns from scratch, who'd learned to navigate office politics and difficult clients, who'd survived moving across the country alone and building a life from nothing. He'd seen me as an easy mark, but he'd forgotten that I was also a Caldwell. I had the same intelligence, the same determination, and the same capacity for long-term planning. The difference was, I used mine honestly. As I finally drifted off to sleep, a plan was already forming in the back of my mind. Marcus had vanished, leaving behind a trail of destruction and unanswered questions. The FBI was doing their job, but they were looking for him to prosecute him. I had different goals. I wanted my life back. I wanted my name cleared.
And I wanted to make sure Marcus never had the opportunity to do this to anyone else ever again. But first, I needed to understand exactly what he'd done and how he'd done it, because if I was going to untangle this mess, I needed to think like Marcus. I needed to get inside the mind of someone who'd spent months planning the perfect crime against his own sister. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day at the downtown library, using their computers to research everything I could about financial fraud, identity theft, and cryptocurrency scams. If I was going to be the victim of a sophisticated financial crime, I was going to be an educated victim. What I learned was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because cases like mine, where family members committed identity theft, usually resulted in the victim being cleared of responsibility once the investigation was complete. Terrifying because the process could take years, and in the meantime, I was legally responsible for debts I'd never incurred. But buried in the legal research, I found something interesting, a case study about a similar fraud where the victim had helped law enforcement by providing insights into the perpetrator's psychology and methods. The victim in that case had been instrumental in tracking down hidden assets and recovering stolen funds. I might not be able to find Marcus, but I knew him better than the FBI did. I knew his habits, his fears, his tells when he was lying. I'd spent 26 years learning to read my brother's moods and motivations. If anyone could figure out where he'd hidden the money or where he might run, it was me. Agent Martinez had told me to be careful and stay out of the investigation, but she'd also said I was a victim who deserved to have my life restored. If I could help make that happen faster, wasn't that worth the risk? I closed the browser and gathered my things. I had work to do, and it started with figuring out exactly how my brother had turned me into someone I'd never been. The first step was getting copies of everything, every document, every loan application, every piece of paperwork that bore my forged signature. Rebecca Torres had warned me this would be painful, like performing surgery on my own identity, but I needed to see the full scope of what Marcus had created. The fictitious Elena Caldwell he'd invented was impressive, I had to admit. According to the loan documents, I was a successful business consultant specializing in cryptocurrency investments and real estate development. I had an MBA from Colorado State University, a degree I'd never earned, and professional references who'd apparently given glowing recommendations about work I'd never performed. The most chilling part was how plausible it all seemed. Marcus had woven just enough truth into the lies to make them believable. The apartment address was real. It was where I'd lived 2 years ago. The employment verification came from phone numbers that, when I called them, went to voicemail boxes with professional-sounding messages claiming to be HR departments for companies that didn't exist. He'd thought of everything, except the possibility that I might fight back. My phone rang, interrupting my document review. Agent Martinez's name appeared on the screen. "Elena, we've had a development. Can you come in this afternoon?" An hour later, I was back in the federal building, but this time, Agent Martinez wasn't alone. She introduced her companion as Agent Harrison from the Financial Crimes Unit, a serious man with gray hair and the kind of steady gaze that suggested he'd seen every possible variation of human greed and stupidity. "We've traced some of the cryptocurrency transactions," Agent Harrison said without preamble. "Your brother was more sophisticated than we initially thought, but he made some mistakes in the final weeks before he disappeared." He pulled out a tablet showing what looked like a complex flowchart of digital transactions. The mining operation was legitimate, but it was a front. Most of the cryptocurrency being generated was immediately converted to cash and transferred to offshore accounts. However, Marcus kept some of the currency in wallets we've been able to identify. How much? I asked. Approximately $400,000, currently sitting in digital wallets that we can monitor but can't yet access. Agent Harrison swiped to another screen. But here's where it gets interesting. The cryptocurrency is still being moved. Small transactions, but regular ones. Someone is still operating these accounts. Marcus? Agent Martinez shook her head. We don't think so. The transaction patterns are different, and the timing suggests someone else has access. Elena, we think your brother had partners, and they're still active. This revelation hit me harder than I'd expected. It was one thing to accept that Marcus had betrayed me. It was another to realize that strangers were still profiting from that betrayal, still using my name and identity for ongoing criminal activity. What does this mean for me? I asked. It means the investigation is expanding, Agent Harrison said. It also means you might be in more danger than we initially thought. If Marcus's partners believe you have access to information about their operations, they might escalate their attempts to contact you. As if summoned by his words, my phone buzzed with another message from an unknown number. We know you're talking to federal agents. This is your last warning. The debt doesn't disappear just because your brother ran away. Both agents leaned forward as I showed them the message. Agent Martinez immediately started typing on her phone. Elena, Agent Harrison said, I need to ask you to consider something. We believe you might be our best chance of understanding how this operation worked and possibly locating your brother. You know him better than anyone. You understand his psychology, his habits, his decision-making patterns. You want me to help you catch him? I said. It wasn't a question. We want to offer you the chance to take control of this situation instead of just reacting to it. Agent Harrison's voice was careful, professional. You can continue being a passive victim, waiting for us to slowly untangle this mess while your credit remains destroyed and your safety remains uncertain, or you can help us end this quickly and definitively. The choice was stark, but it wasn't really a choice at all. I could spend years fighting to prove my innocence while Marcus's criminal partners continued threatening me, or I could help the FBI shut down the entire operation and reclaim my identity. What would you need me to do? I asked. Agent Martinez smiled for the first time since I'd met her. Help us think like Marcus. Help us understand where he might go, what he might do next, how he might try to access the hidden funds. And if he contacts you, help us trace that contact back to wherever he's hiding. I thought about the brother I'd grown up with, the one who'd always been 3 steps ahead of our parents, 3 steps ahead of his teachers, 3 steps ahead of everyone who thought they understood him. The brother who'd convinced me he was helping my financial future while systematically destroying it. Marcus had always been brilliant at seeing angles other people missed, at finding opportunities in chaos, at turning problems into advantages. But he'd also always had one weakness, his ego. He couldn't resist being the smartest person in the room, couldn't resist explaining how clever he'd been once he thought he was safe. Okay, I said, meeting Agent Martinez's gaze, let's catch my brother. That decision would change everything, though I didn't know it yet. I thought I was agreeing to help with a federal investigation. What I was actually doing was declaring war on someone who'd already shown he was willing to destroy his own family for money. Marcus had taught me to be careful with my finances, to plan for the future, to always have a backup strategy. He probably never imagined I'd use those lessons against him. But he was about to find out that the sister he'd turned into a victim had learned a few things about strategy herself. And unlike his schemes, mine were going to be completely legal. The war for my identity was about to begin, and I intended to win. The next morning, I sat in Agent Martinez's office with a legal pad full of notes about my brother's habits, quirks, and psychological patterns. 26 years of knowing someone gives you insights that criminal profilers can't get from surveillance footage and financial records. Marcus was methodical to a fault. Even as a kid, he'd plan elaborate schemes weeks in advance. When he wanted a new video game but didn't have the money, he'd spend days mapping out which chores he could volunteer for, which neighbors might need help with yard work, and exactly how much he needed to earn. He never acted impulsively, which meant his disappearance had been planned long before the FBI started investigating. He also had a tell when he was lying or hiding something. He'd touch his left earlobe, just briefly, like he was adjusting an earring he didn't wear. During our last lunch together, he'd done it at least 6 times while we talked about his work situation. I dismissed it at the time, but now I realized he'd been lying about almost everything we discussed. Agent Harrison leaned forward as I explained Marcus's psychological profile. So you're saying he wouldn't just run without a plan? He'd have multiple contingencies? Multiple contingencies and backup plans for his backup plans. I flipped through my notes. Marcus never did anything halfway. If he was going to disappear, he'd have new identities prepared, safe houses established, and enough money accessible to live comfortably while he figured out his next move.
But Agent Martinez looked troubled. That's what concerns us. We've frozen the accounts we know about, but someone with Marcus's planning ability wouldn't keep all his assets in traceable locations. I'd been thinking about this too. Marcus had always been paranoid about financial security, even before he'd apparently become a criminal. He used to lecture me about keeping cash reserves that banks couldn't freeze, about having assets that couldn't be easily traced or seized. At the time, I thought he was just being overly cautious. Now, I wondered if he'd been preparing for this scenario for years. There's something else, I said. Marcus was obsessed with contingency planning, but he was also obsessed with control. He couldn't stand the idea of other people making decisions about his life or his money. If he's working with partners, that relationship is probably strained by now. Agent Harrison made a note. What makes you say that? Because sharing control would drive him crazy. Marcus always had to be the smartest person in the room, the one with the master plan. If these partners have been moving cryptocurrency without his direct oversight, he's probably furious about it. Agent Martinez exchanged a look with Agent Harrison. That could work in our favor. Criminals under stress make mistakes. Over the following days, I threw myself into understanding the scope of Marcus's operation with the same intensity I'd once applied to college finals. I studied the loan documents, traced the timeline of his activities, and built detailed profiles of each fake business he'd created in my name. The sophistication was staggering. Marcus hadn't just forged signatures, he'd created an entire alternate reality where I was a successful entrepreneur. He'd registered domain names for fake companies, created professional-looking websites with stock photos and fabricated testimonials, and even established social media profiles that made his fictional version of my life seem completely authentic. But the more I studied his work, the more I noticed small inconsistencies, details that seemed off, timeline gaps that didn't make sense, financial transactions that seemed unnecessarily complex. Marcus was brilliant, but he was also human, and humans make mistakes when they're juggling multiple elaborate lies. Rebecca Torres called me into her office 3 days after my meeting with the FBI. She spread out bank statements and loan documents across her conference table like evidence in a murder trial. Elena, I've been reviewing everything with a forensic accountant, and we've found some interesting discrepancies. Your brother was smart about covering his tracks, but he got sloppy toward the end. She pointed to a series of transactions from 2 months ago. Look at these cryptocurrency purchases. They're all made during business hours on weekdays, but according to his employment records, Marcus was supposedly in client meetings during most of these times. So either he was lying to his employer about his schedule, or he wasn't the one making these transactions, I said. Exactly. And here's where it gets more interesting. Rebecca pulled out another document. The IP addresses for these transactions trace back to locations Marcus has never been. Coffee shops in Boulder, office buildings in Fort Collins, even a library in Greeley. Someone else was making financial moves using my stolen identity, and it wasn't Marcus. The realization sent a chill down my spine. How many people had access to my personal information? How many strangers were out there using my name and credit to commit crimes? There's more, Rebecca continued. We found evidence that someone has been accessing the online accounts for your fake businesses as recently as yesterday. The activity logs show login attempts from multiple locations, including some outside of Colorado. My phone rang before I could fully process this information. Agent Martinez's name appeared on the screen, and her voice sounded tense when I answered. Elena, we need you to come in immediately. We've had a development. An hour later, I was back in the federal building, but the atmosphere felt different, more urgent, more serious.
Agent Martinez led me to a different conference room, one with more sophisticated recording equipment and multiple screens showing what looked like surveillance footage. "We found Marcus," Agent Harrison said without preamble. The relief that flooded through me was quickly replaced by confusion when I saw their expressions. If they'd found him, why did they look so grim? "He's in a hospital in Phoenix," Agent Martinez explained. "Intensive care unit. Someone beat him pretty severely 3 days ago." The room seemed to tilt around me. Someone hurt Marcus? But why? "We think he tried to cut his partners out of the operation." Agent Harrison pulled up photos on one of the screens. "These are from the hospital security cameras. Your brother checked in under a false name, but facial recognition software identified him." The photos showed Marcus in a hospital bed, his face swollen and bandaged, connected to various medical equipment. He looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen him. Despite everything he'd done to me, he was still my brother, and seeing him like this made my chest tight with conflicting emotions. "He's been asking for you," Agent Martinez said gently. "The hospital staff says he keeps repeating your name and asking them to call you." "Does he know you found him?" I asked. "Not yet. We've been monitoring his room, but we haven't made contact. We wanted to talk to you first." Agent Harrison leaned forward. "Elena, this could be our opportunity. If Marcus is scared, if he thinks his partners tried to kill him, he might be willing to cooperate. But he's more likely to trust you than us." "You want me to go to Phoenix," I said. "You want me to convince him to turn on his partners." "We want to offer you the chance to get answers." Agent Martinez's voice was careful. "You deserve to know why he did this to you, how extensive the damage is, and where the money is hidden. But I won't lie to you. It would also help our investigation if Marcus decides to cooperate." I stared at the photos of my brother in his hospital bed, weighing the decision. Part of me wanted to see him, to demand explanations and apologies. Another part of me never wanted to see him again, never wanted to risk the emotional manipulation I knew he was capable of. But there was a third part, a part that had been growing stronger since this nightmare began. The part that wanted justice, not just for me, but for anyone else Marcus might victimize in the future. The part that refused to let him disappear again without being held accountable. "I'll go," I said, "but I want full immunity for anything I might discover, and I want protection if his partners figure out what we're doing." Agent Martinez smiled. "Already arranged." The flight to Phoenix gave me time to prepare emotionally for seeing Marcus. I'd written out questions I needed answers to, practiced staying calm no matter what he said, and mentally rehearsed walking away if he tried to manipulate me the way he had for months. But nothing could have prepared me for how I'd actually feel when I walked into his hospital room. Marcus looked terrible. Beyond the obvious injuries, he seemed diminished somehow, like the confidence and self-assurance that had always defined him had been beaten out of him along with everything else. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. "Lena," he whispered, using the childhood nickname he hadn't called me in years. "You came." I stayed near the door, not trusting myself to get closer. "Why, Marcus? Why did you do this to me?" He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, something had changed in his expression. The manipulation, the charm, the careful calculation I'd learned to recognize, it was all gone. What remained looked like genuine remorse. "Because I was desperate, and you were the only person who trusted me completely." His voice was hoarse, whether from his injuries or emotion I couldn't tell. "I never meant for it to get this bad. It got this bad the moment you forged my signature," I said. "You destroyed my credit, my reputation, my sense of security. You made me a target for criminals. How is any of that not as bad as it gets?" Marcus struggled to sit up straighter, wincing with the effort. "You're right. You're completely right, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But Lena, you have to understand. I was in over my head with people who don't accept failure as an option." He gestured weakly toward his bandaged face. "This is what happens when you try to back out of deals with them." "Who are they?" I moved closer despite myself. "Marcus, who are these people?" "The cryptocurrency operation was supposed to be legitimate," he said. "At first, it was. But when the market crashed and we started losing money, they wanted me to find new ways to generate returns. That's when they suggested using other people's identities to secure additional financing."
Other people? I said, my voice flat. You mean me? You were just supposed to be temporary collateral. Marcus's words came out in a rush. I thought I could make enough money to pay everything back before you ever found out, but every scheme just dug the hole deeper. Temporary collateral? I repeated the phrase, tasting how clinical it sounded. Is that what you told yourself when you were forging my signature? That I was just temporary collateral? Tears were streaming down Marcus's bruised face now. I told myself a lot of lies, Lena, but the biggest one was that I was protecting you. The truth is, I was only protecting myself. Despite my anger, despite everything he'd done, seeing my brother broken and terrified sparked something in me that felt like pity. But I couldn't let that emotion derail the conversation I'd come here to have. I need names, Marcus. I need to know who these people are, where the money is, and how to make this stop. If I tell you, they'll kill me. His voice was barely above a whisper. They already tried once. If you don't tell me, the FBI will assume you're still protecting them, and I'll never forgive you. I sat down in the chair next to his bed. Marcus, this is your chance to do the right thing. Probably the only chance you'll get. He was quiet for so long I thought he'd fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Resigned, maybe, or just exhausted. The main guy calls himself Davidson, but that's not his real name. He runs operations out of a compound outside Sedona. Private security, multiple businesses that are probably all fronts. He's the one who suggested expanding into identity theft when the crypto mining stopped being profitable. I took notes as Marcus continued, describing a network of criminals far more sophisticated than I'd imagined. Davidson's organization apparently specialized in financial fraud, using stolen identities to secure loans that funded various illegal enterprises. Marcus had been recruited because of his financial expertise and his access to potential victims. How many other people did you do this to? I asked. You were the only family member, Marcus said quickly, but there were others. Davidson's people would identify targets, and I'd create the paperwork to make the loans happen. How many others, Marcus? At least 12 that I know of, maybe more. The scope of it hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just destroyed my life, he'd been part of an operation that had destroyed at least 12 other lives. People who were probably still discovering forged signatures and false debts, just like I had been 2 weeks ago. Where's the money now? I asked. That's complicated. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his hospital bed. Davidson kept most of it, but he also demanded that each of us maintain emergency funds that could be accessed quickly if law enforcement got close. Emergency funds where? Safety deposit boxes, cryptocurrency wallets, offshore accounts. Marcus met my eyes. I can give you the information, but Lena, if Davidson finds out I talked, he won't just come after me, he'll come after you too. The threat hung in the air between us, but I'd already made my decision. Let him come, I said. I'm tired of being afraid of men who think they can destroy women's lives without consequences. Marcus actually smiled at that, though it obviously hurt his injured face. There's the sister I remember. You were always braver than me. I wasn't brave, I was desperate. But maybe that was enough. Over the next 2 hours, Marcus gave me information that would later help the FBI dismantle Davidson's entire organization. Bank account numbers, cryptocurrency wallet addresses, names of other victims, locations of safe houses, even details about Davidson's security arrangements and daily routines. But the most valuable information was personal. Marcus told me about Davidson's psychology, his weaknesses, his fears. Like Marcus, Davidson was arrogant and controlling. Unlike Marcus, he was also violent and unpredictable. He's going to assume I told you everything, Marcus said as our conversation wound down, which means you're now as much of a threat to him as I am. I stood up to leave, but Marcus grabbed my hand with surprising strength. Lena, I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but please be careful. Davidson isn't just a white-collar criminal. He's hurt people before, and he won't hesitate to hurt you if he thinks it's necessary. I squeezed his hand briefly, then pulled away. I'll be careful, Marcus, but I won't hide. As I left the hospital, I felt like I was carrying the weight of not just my own stolen identity, but the identities of at least 12 other victims, people who deserved justice just as much as I did. Agent Martinez was waiting in the hotel lobby when I returned, and I could tell from her expression that she'd been monitoring our conversation through whatever surveillance equipment they'd planted in Marcus's room. How much of that was useful? I asked. All of it. Agent Harrison appeared from behind a pillar, looking satisfied. Elena, what your brother just gave us is enough to take down an operation we've been investigating for almost 2 years. So what happens now? Now we build a case that will put Davidson and his associates in federal prison for the next 20 years. Agent Martinez stood up. But first, we need to make sure you're safe. The next few days were a blur of safe houses, depositions, and strategy meetings. The FBI moved quickly, using Marcus's information to obtain warrants and freeze accounts before Davidson's organization could realize they'd been compromised. But on the third day, Agent Martinez received a call that changed everything. Elena, Davidson's compound is empty. They cleared out sometime last night. The bottom dropped out of my stomach. Does that mean they know Marcus talked? We have to assume they do. Agent Harrison looked grim, which means they probably know you were involved in getting that information. I thought about David's profile as Marcus had described it. Arrogant, controlling, violent, and now desperate. A man who'd built his criminal empire on the assumption that he was always the smartest person in the room, suddenly faced with the reality that his operation had been infiltrated by federal agents. He's going to come after me, isn't he?
I said, "We're going to make sure that doesn't happen." Agent Martinez's voice was firm. "Elena, you've given us everything we need to destroy Davidson's network. Now it's our job to protect you while we hunt them down." But I'd been thinking about more than just my own safety. What about the other victims? The 12 people Marcus mentioned. Are they safe? Agent Harrison nodded. "We're contacting all of them today. They'll receive the same protection protocols you're getting." That night, alone in a safe house that looked like every generic hotel room in America, I finally allowed myself to process everything that had happened over the past 3 weeks. 3 weeks ago, I'd been Elena Caldwell, junior marketing coordinator, worried about making rent and building an emergency fund. Now I was Elena Caldwell, federal witness in a major financial crimes case, temporarily living under FBI protection while dangerous criminals tried to figure out how to silence me permanently. The person I'd been 3 weeks ago would have been terrified, would have hidden in this safe house and waited for other people to solve her problems. But that person had been naive enough to trust her brother with complete access to her personal information. That person had been passive enough to let other people make decisions about her financial future. I wasn't that person anymore. My phone, which the FBI had secured with new encryption software, buzzed with a text from Sarah. She was one of the few people who knew how to reach me, and her messages had been my lifeline to normalcy over the past few days. "Missing you, but proud of you. Let me know when it's safe to plan a girls' night that doesn't require FBI approval." I smiled, typing back, "Soon. And Sarah, when this is over, I'm buying you the most expensive bottle of wine we can find. I owe you everything." Her response came quickly. "You don't owe me anything except a promise to never trust your brother with your personal information again." If only it were that simple. But Marcus wasn't just my brother anymore. He was a federal witness whose cooperation would be crucial in prosecuting Davidson and his associates. Eventually, I'd have to face the complicated reality of having a family relationship with someone who'd committed crimes against me. But that was a problem for future Elena. Present Elena had more immediate concerns. Agent Martinez had mentioned that Davidson was arrogant and controlling, but she'd also said he was smart enough to run a multi-million-dollar fraud operation for years without being caught, smart enough to recruit people like Marcus who could provide the technical expertise he needed. What if Davidson was smart enough to realize that the best way to get revenge against Marcus wasn't to hurt him directly? What if he'd figured out that hurting me would be far more devastating to Marcus than any physical violence? The thought should have terrified me, but instead it clarified something I'd been struggling with since this whole nightmare began. I was tired of being reactive, tired of waiting for other people to make decisions about my life. Davidson wanted to use me as a weapon against Marcus, to turn me into another victim whose suffering would serve his purposes. But what if I refused to be a victim? What if I decided to become something else entirely? I opened my laptop and started typing.
Not notes about Marcus or Davidson or the federal investigation. Instead, I started researching everything I could find about financial fraud recovery, victim advocacy, and how to rebuild a destroyed credit history. If I was going to survive this, I needed to understand not just how Davidson's operation worked, but how to systematically dismantle the damage it had caused. Not just for me, but for every victim whose life had been turned upside down by men who thought other people's identities were disposable resources. Marcus had taught me to plan for the future, to always have backup strategies, to never depend entirely on other people for my financial security. I was about to apply those lessons in ways he'd never intended. The war wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But this time, I wasn't fighting just to get my life back. I was fighting to build something better than what I'd had before.
The plan was for me to spend the day in visible public locations where Davidson's people were likely to spot me. Coffee shops, shopping centers, places where someone could observe me without being too conspicuous themselves. But I wouldn't be alone. FBI surveillance teams would be positioned throughout each location, ready to move the moment Davidson's people made contact. Our first stop was a Starbucks near the University of Denver campus, chosen because it had multiple exits and good sightlines for surveillance. I ordered my usual coffee and found a table near the window, opening my laptop like I was working on something important. 20 minutes later, Agent Martinez's voice came through the earpiece I was wearing. "Elena, we have a possible contact. Man in a gray jacket at the counter. Been watching you since you sat down." I glanced up casually and saw him immediately. Mid-30s, expensive clothes that didn't quite fit right, the kind of artificial, casual look that screamed trying too hard. He caught my eye and smiled in a way that was probably supposed to seem friendly, but felt predatory instead. "He's approaching," Agent Martinez warned. The man walked over to my table, coffee in hand, and gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Mind if I sit? It's pretty crowded in here." It really wasn't crowded, but I nodded anyway. "Sure. I'm David," he said, settling into the chair with the confidence of someone who was used to being in control of conversations. "You look familiar. Do we know each other?" "I don't think so," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Are you a student here?" "No, just visiting Denver on business." David's smile got whiter, more artificial. "Financial consulting. You know how it is. Always traveling, always meeting new people." The words sent a chill down my spine, but I kept my expression politely interested. "Sounds exciting." "It can be." David leaned forward slightly. "Though lately, business has been complicated. Some of our clients have been uncooperative." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. David wasn't here by coincidence, and he wasn't just making conversation. He was letting me know that he knew exactly who I was and why he'd been sent to find me. "That must be frustrating," I said. "Very." David's voice hardened, almost imperceptibly. "But we usually find ways to encourage cooperation. People are more reasonable than they initially appear once they understand the full scope of their situation." I heard Agent Martinez's voice through my earpiece. "Elena, we're ready to move. Just give us a signal." But something held me back. David was here to intimidate me, possibly to hurt me, but he was also here to gather information. Information that might help the FBI understand Davidson's current plans and capabilities. "What kind of cooperation are you looking for?" I asked. David's smile turned genuinely pleased, like I'd just passed some kind of test. "Smart question. We're looking for help recovering some assets that were recently frozen by federal authorities, assets that belong to our organization, not to the government. And you think I can help with that? We think your brother can help with that." David's voice dropped lower, more intimate. "And we think you might be able to convince him that cooperation is in everyone's best interest."
The conversation was moving exactly where the FBI had hoped it would. Davidson was confirming that Davidson's organization still believed they could use me to manipulate Marcus into helping them recover their frozen funds. "What makes you think my brother would listen to me?" I asked. "We're not exactly close these days." "Family bonds are stronger than temporary disagreements." David reached across the table and touched my hand, a gesture that looked casual but felt like a claim of ownership. "Especially when family members understand that their safety depends on those bonds remaining strong." There it was, the direct threat I'd been waiting for. "I understand," I said, meeting his gaze steadily. "When and where do you want to meet?" David looked surprised that I'd agreed so quickly. "Tonight. There's a warehouse district in Commerce City, abandoned building on Industrial Boulevard. Come alone at 10 o'clock. "What if I bring company?" Then the conversation becomes much less friendly. David stood up, his artificial smile returning. "But I'm sure you'll make the right choice, Elena." He walked away without looking back, leaving me sitting at the table with my heart pounding and FBI surveillance teams tracking David's movement out of the coffee shop. "Elena, did you just agree to meet him? That wasn't part of the plan." "I know," I whispered, pretending to sip my coffee while FBI surveillance teams tracked David's movement out of the coffee shop. "But he just told us where they are and when they want to meet. That's better intelligence than we had this morning." Agent Martinez appeared at my table 5 minutes later, sliding into the chair David had vacated. "Elena, what you just did was incredibly dangerous. You deviated from the plan without authorization." "I deviated from the plan because the opportunity was too good to pass up." I closed my laptop and looked directly at her. "Agent Martinez, they've been one step ahead of this investigation since the beginning. Tonight, for the first time, we know exactly where they'll be and when. And you want to walk into an obvious trap? I want to spring an obvious trap. There's a difference." Agent Martinez studied my face with the same intensity as she'd shown during our first meeting 3 weeks ago. "Elena, I need to know that you understand what you're volunteering for. This isn't a movie. If something goes wrong tonight, people could seriously get hurt or killed." "I understand that. I also understand that these people have been threatening me for weeks, that they've destroyed my life and the lives of at least 12 other people, and that they won't stop until someone stops them." Agent Martinez was quiet for a moment, then pulled out her phone. "I need to make some calls. We'll need backup teams, tactical support, and a complete operational plan developed in the next 6 hours. Does that mean you're agreeing to the warehouse meeting?" "It means I'm agreeing that you've given us the best chance we've had to end this thing quickly and definitively." Agent Martinez stood up. "But Elena, if we do this, you follow orders exactly. No improvisation, no heroics, no deviating from the plan." "Agreed." As we left the coffee shop, I felt the familiar mixture of fear and determination that had been driving me since this whole nightmare had begun. But there was something else too. Something I hadn't expected. Excitement. For weeks, I'd been reacting to other people's decisions, responding to threats and revelations and federal investigations. Tonight, for the first time, I was going to be the one making decisions. I was going to be the one in control. Davidson had made the mistake of assuming I was just another victim, someone who could be intimidated and manipulated into compliance. He was about to discover that the woman he'd been threatening had learned a few things about strategy herself. And unlike his schemes, mine had the full backing of the federal government. The abandoned warehouse on Industrial Boulevard looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for a criminal meetup.
Broken windows, rusted metal siding, and enough shadows to hide an army of federal agents, which, according to Agent Martinez, was exactly what we were hoping for. I sat in the back of an unmarked van 3 blocks away, watching feeds from surveillance cameras that FBI technicians had somehow installed around the building in the 6 hours since my coffee shop encounter with David. The operation had moved with military precision, transforming what should have been a terrifying trap into what Agent Martinez called a controlled takedown scenario. "Elena, you still have time to change your mind about this," Agent Harrison said, adjusting the communications equipment I'd be wearing. "We can send in an undercover agent who looks similar to you." I shook my head. David has seen me up close. He'll know if you send someone else, and then this whole operation falls apart. The plan was elegantly simple in concept, terrifying in execution. I would go into the warehouse at the appointed time, wearing enough surveillance equipment to broadcast everything to the FBI teams positioned around the building. My job was to get Davidson's people to confirm their crimes on tape while federal agents moved into position for arrests. But plans have a way of getting complicated when they encounter reality. At 9:45, Agent Martinez drove me to within 2 blocks of the warehouse. The Denver night was crisp and clear, with enough streetlights to make surveillance easier, but enough shadows to provide cover for the tactical teams. "Remember," Agent Martinez said as I got out of the car, "your safety is our primary concern. If anything feels wrong, if the situation seems to be escalating beyond our control, you use the panic signal and we move immediately." The panic signal was a simple phrase: "I need to call my brother." 5 words that would trigger an immediate tactical response from teams positioned around the building. I walked toward the warehouse, my footsteps echoing off empty sidewalks in a way that seemed unnaturally loud. The building loomed ahead of me, dark except for a single light visible through one of the broken windows on the 2nd floor. "Elena, this is Martinez. We have you on visual. Everything looks normal so far." The main entrance to the warehouse was a heavy metal door that had been propped open with a concrete block. I stepped inside, immediately hit by the smell of rust, dust, and something else I couldn't identify but didn't like. The interior was a maze of abandoned machinery and shipping containers, lit only by industrial fixtures that cast harsh shadows in all directions. Perfect place for an ambush, terrible place for a rescue operation. "Up here," called a voice from somewhere above me, 2nd floor, northeast corner. I found a staircase that looked like it might support my weight and climbed carefully, each step producing a metallic creak that announced my presence to anyone within 50 yards. The 2nd floor was more open than the ground level, a former office space that had been stripped of everything except some metal desks and filing cabinets. David was waiting for me, but he wasn't alone. 3 other men stood around the room, positioned in ways that blocked the most obvious exit routes. They were all dressed similarly to David, expensive casual clothes that didn't quite mask the fact that they were built like people who solved problems with violence. "Elena, glad you could make it," David said, gesturing to a metal chair in the center of the room. "Please, have a seat. We have a lot to discuss." I remained standing. "I'd rather hear what you want first." Direct approach, I like that. David walked over to one of the metal desks and pulled out a tablet computer. "What we want is simple. We want your brother to help us access funds that were frozen by federal authorities." He swiped through screens showing bank account information, cryptocurrency wallets, and what looked like real estate holdings, all totaling far more than the $1 million Marcus had described. "This represents 2 years of careful planning and investment," David continued. "Money that belongs to our organization, not to some government bureaucrats who don't understand international finance." "International finance?" I repeated. "Is that what we're calling fraud now?" One of the other men took a step toward me, but David held up a hand to stop him. "Elena, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of our business. We provide financial services to clients who need discretion and flexibility, services that traditional banks are too bureaucratic to offer. Services like stealing people's identities and destroying their credit," I said. David's friendly mask slipped slightly. "Your brother chose to expand our client services in that direction. We simply provided the infrastructure and support he needed to be successful." The blame shifting was so predictable it was almost boring. Even facing federal prosecution, these people couldn't take responsibility for the damage they'd caused. "So what exactly do you want from me?" I asked. "We want you to visit your brother in Phoenix and convince him that cooperation with federal authorities is not in his best interest." David's voice hardened. "We want you to explain that his family's safety depends on his willingness to help us recover our assets." "And if I refuse?" David smiled, and this time there was nothing artificial about it. "Elena, you're a smart woman. I'm sure you can imagine the consequences of refusing to help us." Agent Martinez's voice came through my earpiece. "Elena, we're ready to move. Give us the signal." But I hesitated. These men had threatened me, destroyed my credit, and turned my life upside down for weeks.
They'd beaten my brother and were now trying to use me as leverage to avoid prosecution for their crimes. I was tired of being afraid of them. Actually, David, I think you're the one who doesn't understand the situation here, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. David's expression shifted from confident to confused. What do you mean? I mean, you made a mistake when you decided to target me. You assumed I was just another victim who would be too scared to fight back. Elena, what are you doing? Agent Martinez's voice was urgent in my ear. But I was committed now. You see, David, what you didn't know is that I've been working with the FBI for weeks. Every conversation we've had, every threat you've made, every detail about your operation has been recorded and transmitted to federal agents. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and electric. David's friendly facade disappeared entirely, replaced by something cold and dangerous. You're lying, he said. Am I? I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen, which displayed an active call to Agent Martinez. David, say hello to Special Agent Martinez of the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. The response was immediate and violent. Two of David's associates moved toward me, while the third one ran for what I assumed was an alternative exit route. But they were too late. The warehouse erupted in coordinated chaos as FBI tactical teams breached the building from multiple directions simultaneously. Shouts of "Federal agents, hands up!" echoed through the space, followed by the distinctive sounds of flashbang grenades and tactical equipment. I dropped to the floor as instructed during the briefing, covering my head while federal agents swarmed the room. The entire takedown took less than 90 seconds from start to finish. When the dust settled, David and his 3 associates were in federal custody, and I was sitting in the back of an ambulance getting checked for injuries I didn't have, while Agent Martinez debriefed me on what had just happened. Elena, what you did in there was incredibly reckless, she said, though her tone suggested she was more impressed than angry. Revealing the surveillance operation to suspects could have gotten you killed. I know, I said. But David, these people had been controlling the narrative since the beginning. They thought they were so smart, so several steps ahead of law enforcement. I wanted them to know that they'd been wrong about everything. Agent Harrison joined us, looking satisfied in the way that suggested the operation had exceeded expectations. Elena, what you just helped us accomplish tonight will shut down one of the most sophisticated financial fraud operations we've encountered. David and his associates are facing federal charges that will put them away for decades. What about the money? I asked. The funds they stole from me and the other victims? We recovered account information and cryptocurrency wallet access codes that should allow us to restore most of the stolen funds. Agent Harrison smiled. Elena, within the next few months, your credit should be completely restored, and you should receive compensation for the damages you've suffered. The relief that flooded through me was so intense it felt physical. For the first time in weeks, I could imagine a future that wasn't dominated by debt, ruined credit, and fear of criminal retaliation. But there was still one more conversation I needed to have. 2 days later, I was back in Phoenix, sitting in the same hospital room where Marcus was recovering from his injuries. He looked better than he had during my first visit, though the guilt and shame in his expression hadn't improved at all. Lena, Agent Martinez told me what you did.
Marcus's voice was hoarse with emotion. She said you put yourself in danger to help catch Davidson and his people. I sat down in the chair next to his bed, studying the brother I'd grown up with, trying to reconcile the person I'd known with the criminal who destroyed my life. I didn't do it to help you, Marcus. I did it because those people needed to be stopped, and I was in a position to help make that happen. He nodded, accepting the distinction. I know, and I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. You're right, you don't. I kept my voice steady, businesslike. But Marcus, I need to understand something. Did you ever, even for a moment, consider what this would do to me? Every day, he said quietly, but I told myself that I'd figure out a way to fix it before you ever found out. I convinced myself that I was protecting you by not involving you in the details. You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself from having to face what you were doing. Marcus closed his eyes, and when he opened them, tears were streaming down his face. You're right. I was a coward who destroyed his sister's life rather than admit he'd failed. I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation and charm that had always been his default tools for getting out of trouble, but all I saw was genuine remorse and self-hatred. Marcus, I can't forgive you right now. Maybe someday, but not today. What I can do is tell you that I'm not going to let what you did define the rest of my life. I stood up to leave, but Marcus grabbed my hand. Lena, for what it's worth, I'm proud of you. What you did took more courage than I've ever had. I squeezed his hand briefly, then pulled away. Take care of yourself, Marcus. As I left the hospital, I felt like I was finally closing a chapter that had dominated my life for weeks. Marcus would face federal prosecution, serve time in prison, and hopefully emerge as someone who'd learned from the damage he'd caused. But my story was just beginning. 6 months later, I was sitting in my own office in downtown Denver, looking out at the Rocky Mountains and reviewing applications for the victim advocacy program I'd started with the settlement money from the FBI case. The program provided free financial counseling, legal assistance, and emotional support to people whose identities had been stolen by family members. It turned out that Marcus and Davidson's operation wasn't unique. Financial abuse by family members was more common than I'd realized, and resources for victims were surprisingly limited. Sarah knocked on my door, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of smile that suggested good news. Elena, you've got 3 new clients this week, 2 speaking engagements next month, and a reporter from CNN who wants to interview you about the program. I accepted the coffee gratefully. The program had grown faster than I'd ever imagined possible, partly because there was such a need for these services, but also because my story had attracted media attention that helped raise awareness about family financial abuse. Also, Sarah continued, sitting down in the chair across from my desk, Agent Martinez called. The final restitution payments came through. Your credit score is officially higher than it was before Marcus started his scheme. The financial recovery had been more complete than anyone had expected. Not only had the FBI recovered most of the stolen funds, but the prosecution of Davidson's organization had led to additional settlements that more than compensated me for the damage to my credit and the emotional distress of the experience. But the most valuable thing I'd gained wasn't money or restored credit. It was the knowledge that I was capable of more than I'd ever imagined. The Elena who'd sat in that conference room 6 months ago, learning that her brother had stolen her identity, had seen herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She'd been overwhelmed by the complexity of financial fraud and dependent on other people to solve her problems. The Elena sitting in her own office now understood that she'd never actually been helpless. She'd been unprepared and uninformed, but she'd also been intelligent, determined, and capable of learning everything she needed to know to take control of her situation. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and for a moment, the old fear flickered through me. But when I read the message, I smiled. Miss Caldwell, my name is Jennifer Torres, and my sister has been forging my signature on loan applications. I saw your interview on the local news. Can you help me? I forwarded the message to Sarah, who immediately started pulling up intake forms and scheduling information. This is what made everything worth it. Not the money, not the media attention, not even the satisfaction of seeing Davidson and his associates sentenced to federal prison. It was the knowledge that my experience could help other people avoid becoming victims, and that victims who did exist didn't have to face the recovery process alone. I'd learned that the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about using the strength they forced you to develop to build something better than what existed before. Marcus had tried to turn me into collateral damage in his criminal scheme. Instead, he'd accidentally turned me into someone who understood exactly how financial predators operated and how to fight them effectively. 6 months ago, I'd been Elena Caldwell, junior marketing coordinator, living paycheck to paycheck, and trusting other people to manage the important decisions in her life. Now, I was Elena Caldwell, victim advocate, business owner, and expert in financial fraud recovery. I had a waiting list of clients, speaking engagements booked months in advance, and enough financial security to never worry about making rent again. But more importantly, I'd learned that I was capable of facing whatever challenges came next with confidence instead of fear. My phone rang, and Agent Martinez's name appeared on the screen. Elena, I hope you're sitting down. We just arrested Marcus's former partners in a new identity theft scheme. Apparently, they didn't learn their lesson from the first prosecution. I wasn't surprised. Criminals rarely change their methods until consequences made those methods impossible to continue. Do you need me to testify again? I asked. Actually, no. We have enough evidence from their new crimes that we don't need testimony from the previous case. Agent Martinez paused. But Elena, I wanted to tell you something. The work you're doing now, helping other victims, it's preventing more cases like yours from happening. Thank you for saying that. Elena, when I first met you 6 months ago, you were probably the most cooperative victim I'd ever worked with. But you were still thinking like a victim. Now, you're thinking like someone who refuses to let criminals win. After I hung up, I sat back in my chair and looked around my office. Photos of clients who'd successfully recovered from identity theft, awards from victim advocacy organizations, diplomas from the financial counseling certification programs I'd completed, evidence of the life I'd built from the ashes of the life Marcus had destroyed. Sarah knocked on my door again, this time looking slightly overwhelmed. Elena, you have 4 more potential clients who called this afternoon. The Colorado Attorney General's office wants to discuss expanding your program statewide, and someone from the Federal Trade Commission wants to schedule a meeting about policy recommendations. I smiled, feeling the same mixture of excitement and determination that had driven me through the warehouse confrontation 6 months earlier. Schedule them all, I said. We've got work to do. That evening, I drove home to the house I'd bought in a quiet Denver neighborhood, using the settlement money as a down payment on something much nicer than I'd ever imagined being able to afford. As I pulled into my driveway, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, struggling to make rent on a shared apartment, trusting her brother to help manage her finances, believing that her biggest problems were deciding between name brand and generic groceries. That woman had been naive, but she'd also been resilient. She'd survived having her identity stolen, her credit destroyed, and her life threatened by criminals. She'd learned to navigate federal investigations, legal proceedings, and media attention. But most importantly, she'd learned that she didn't have to accept other people's definitions of who she was or what she was capable of. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the home I'd chosen, furnished, and paid for entirely through my own efforts. Tomorrow, I'd wake up and continue building something that helped other people recover from the same kind of betrayal I'd experienced. But tonight, I was just Elena Caldwell, survivor, advocate, and architect of her own future. Marcus had tried to steal my identity, but he'd accidentally given me something far more valuable. He'd given me the opportunity to discover exactly how strong I was when everything I thought I knew about my life turned out to be wrong. I took that opportunity and built a life that was more meaningful, more secure, and more authentic than anything I'd had before. Sometimes, the best revenge really is living well. But sometimes, it's using the weapons your enemies gave you to make sure they can never hurt anyone else the same way again. I'd done both, and I'd never felt more like myself than I did right now. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.